One of the most contentious things throughout regular show's run was how the show handled romance. The show proved that the writers know how to write it, but for a large chunk of its run decided not to for the sake of a prolonged bit and at the expense of one of the show's main characters, Mordecai, due to his interactions with Margaret. On the other hand, we get Rigby, Muscle Man, and Skips with these interesting character-defining romantic arcs that add something positive to each of them. Even with Mordecai, his character was way more interesting when he was with CJ as opposed to how his character was treated before he got with Margaret or even when he was with her. The focus of this video is to look at the romances for Mordecai and Rigby and break down why one worked and the other didn't. Let's get to it. I'm gonna start with Mordo, since a notable chunk of the show revolved around his romantic endeavors and him fumbling around in his love life. Starting from the beginning, we have him hardly being able to talk to Margaret, a character that wasn't all that interesting, which made this romance subplot of the series significantly less interesting than any other romantic plot in the series. An issue I've had and have seen a lot of online discourse about since the show was airing is that these episodes bring out the worst parts of Mordecai's character, as well as making the entire episode centered around him trying to talk to or impress Margaret in the early seasons, which can lead to an episode being less interesting than the episodes that these tend to be sandwiched in between. Me saying that these episodes bring out the worst in Mordecai is excluding things like him pushing Rigby into a void between space-time, because let's be real, Rigby deserved it, because he pushed Mordecai first in that situation. I'm more so referring to how convoluted his schemes tend to be to even talk to Margaret, or how far he's willing to go to impress her. If this happened once or twice, then it's whatever. It's that this was how the show consistently portrayed Mordecai for the first few seasons, and how it would always result in Margaret disregarding Mordecai to date her boyfriend for the week, and I didn't really care for that. While I hate the notion that just because somebody's nice to you, you have to date them, I also don't like watching shows where somebody can bend over backwards, constantly embarrassing themselves just for a chance that somebody might look their way. That's not really that fun to watch. To add more to that, Margaret lacking any significant amount of character throughout her whole stint in the show, but especially in the first few seasons, makes it harder for me to care. What little amount of characterization we got from her was alright, giving a feeling of her possibly being an interesting character later down the line, and then we get introduced to CJ, a character who, from her introduction, is infinitely more interesting than Margaret, with a real character and seamlessly fitting into episodes that she's in, and also proving to have a lot of chemistry with Mordecai and the rest of the cast when she interacts with them. She understands him and keeps him from pulling a Mordecai and thinking himself in circles like he has consistently done throughout the series. This was something that was simply not possible with how they handled Margaret. She was the prize, something to be won. CJ had her own character, her own agency, without Mordecai's involvement. She was good at sports, she had hobbies like air hockey, she was able to bounce jokes off of other characters and was genuinely a great addition to the main cast alongside Eileen, who was also amazing. But after all of that, the writers brought Margaret back in, and it made a smooth sailing ship hit an iceberg at full speed, and from what I saw, the fan base was not happy. Reintroducing Margaret and the constant will they won't they that the two characters were put in while Mordecai was in a healthy relationship with CJ, something that is called out several times, was very annoying. I can't stand cheaters, and so much of what was going on here either felt like it was past that line or close enough to give me a lot of frustration watching it. But eventually we end up at Muscle Man's wedding, an episode of regular show I consistently skip when rewatching it because it is genuinely hard for me to get through it without cringing so hard that I go do something else with my time. It's not a fun watch for me. Essentially, Mordo, at his friend / co-worker's wedding, does this roundabout way of telling one of the two women he's kinda leading on that he chooses her, but he doesn't get to finish what he's saying and he ends the day single, as it should be. crashing a wedding when you're supposed to hype up your friend was definitely a choice, but overall, Mordo becomes a less likable character from here on, with Rigby becoming the more likable part of the duo. And speaking of Rigby, he only benefited from getting with Eileen. At the beginning of the show and for most of its run, he was a prick. This dickhead would do everything in his power to inconvenience everyone around him, and that didn't really change until the hints about him and Eileen start dropping. Him knowing the location of her spare key and going to her house to see her rock polisher. Things like that. Before that, Eileen was annoying and Rigby was an awful individual who deserved every bit of pain people hit him with. In their first interaction, it's very clear that Eileen is interested in Rigby, but she shows her interest to him in the most obnoxious ways. And do me a solid, Mordecai and Rigby went on a double date with Margaret and Eileen, with Margaret going so that Eileen could try to impress Rigby, the inverse of what's happening on the other side. However, later on in the episode Camping Can Be Cool, Eileen is significantly more laid back and is actually cool in a nerdy way, showing off her knowledge while playing video games with Rigby, showing that these two can get along while their tall counterparts continue to flail around in a confused daze. After seeing the more interesting side of her, Eileen does get noticed by Rigby, with him even having to admit that he thinks she's hot without her glasses on. Something Eileen now knew because she was also in Margaret's apartment when the boys and Skips were in there doing their ritual. This was the confirmation needed to know that this was happening. Ships have sailed with less wind and a shoddier boat, so this was all that was needed, but it was far from the last thing we got. Around the time that CJ became a character in this series, Eileen was also getting integrated into the main cast, becoming a more frequent character until eventually she would become a main character, though secondary to Mordecai and Rigby. I'm going to skip ahead to the real meat of this ship. Eileen being in Rigby's life made him a better person and a more interesting character. Before they were in a relationship, she just liked to help him, like when he needed help doing a pull-up, but eventually when they got together, her presence in his life made him go back to school and eventually start doing it for himself, with her being an amazing support for him, to them not having any of the foolishness that went on with Mordo and his attempts at romance. Seeing how his initial bitterness toward her faded and Eileen becoming his support to make him a better person was really interesting. Even things we know Rigby wouldn't normally do, he does because he's doing it with Eileen, like with the rock polisher, though there is a non-zero chance that that was just a sex joke. With Eileen driving him to be better, Rigby became a genuinely likable character by the end of the show, and Eileen earned her spot in the main cast. It definitely helped that the episodes with both of them in it didn't default to being a romance-focused episode, though a lot of them were, and the episodes didn't go out of their way to make an ass out of Rigby like they would do if Mordecai was in the same position. And they would frequently do the opposite, making him a better character when Eileen was around. It is worth noting that had Rigby and Eileen been something that the show established sooner, it probably would have been just as much of, if not more of a mess, but thankfully we don't live in that timeline. But that's what I've got for today. I'll eventually take a look at the other park employees and how their romances were written. If you have anything to add, throw it down below. I'm interested in what you have to say. Leave a like if you enjoyed and check out another video if you stuck around until the end. That's what I've got for today. Subscribe and have a nice day. Take care.